It was a case that rocked the city of Hazleton 57 years ago. A little girl walking to school, kidnapped, raped, and murdered. All this time later, state police just announced this morning they know who killed Marise Chiverella.
59 years ago, 9-year-old Marise Chiverella left her home in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, for what should have been an ordinary 6-block walk to school. In her bag were 2 cans of fruit she planned to give her teacher as a small gift for a feast day. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture that reflected the quiet, kind-hearted little girl her family knew. She never arrived. By that afternoon, Marise's body had been discovered in a coal refuse pit on the outskirts of town. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The canned goods she had carried with such care that morning were found beside her. The crime shattered a community that believed children were safe walking to school alone. Investigators poured decades of work into finding the person responsible. Hundreds of officers would touch the case. Advances in forensic science would come and go, yet the answer remained hidden for nearly 58 years. Then, in 2022, everything changed. Not because a longtime suspect finally confessed. Not because a forgotten witness came forward, but because a young genealogy researcher followed a trail that generations of investigators never could. And when the truth finally emerged, it revealed an irony almost impossible to comprehend. The man responsible had lived only a few blocks away all along. But before we dive deep into this story, please let us know where you are watching from. And if stories like this interest you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. To understand why Marise Chiverella's murder left such a lasting scar, it's important to understand the town where it happened. In the early 1960s, Hazleton was a hard-working coal community in northeastern Pennsylvania. Although the mining industry was beginning to decline, its traditions still shaped everyday life. Families often knew one another by name, neighbors looked out for each other's children, and the local Catholic parishes served as the heart of the community. It was a place built on routine. Each morning, children walked to school without their parents. Shop owners greeted familiar faces. Church bells marked the rhythm of the day. In a town like Hazleton, a 6-block walk to school wasn't considered dangerous. It was simply part of growing up. The landscape surrounding the town also carried reminders of its industrial past. Scattered beyond the neighborhoods were abandoned coal stripping sites and refuse pits, leftovers from decades of mining. Many had become informal dumping grounds, isolated places that locals recognized but rarely visited. One of those abandoned coal pits would soon become forever linked to the darkest day in Hazleton's history. The murder of a young schoolgirl did more than take an innocent life. It broke a sense of security that many residents had taken for granted. Parents who once watched their children walk away without worry began seeing those same streets differently. For decades afterward, the case remained more than an unsolved murder. It became a defining memory for the town itself. A painful reminder of the day an ordinary school morning became one of Pennsylvania's longest and most haunting cold cases. For those who knew her, Marise Chiverella was simply a little girl with a quiet nature and a generous heart. She was 9 years old, a third-grade student at St. Joseph's Parochial School in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Family members remembered her as shy, polite, and deeply devoted to her faith. She loved playing the organ at home, enjoyed spending time with her brothers and sisters, and often told her family she hoped to become a nun one day. She found joy in ordinary childhood moments, and kindness seemed to come naturally to her. On Wednesday, March 18, 1964, that kindness shaped what would become the final morning of her life. One of the nuns at St. Joseph's was celebrating a feast day, and Marise wanted to bring her teacher a small gift. Before leaving home, she carefully selected 2 cans of fruit from her father's neighborhood grocery store. Rather than walking with her siblings as she usually did, she decided to leave a little earlier so she could place the gift in the classroom before the school day began. It was a decision no one could have imagined would change everything. At approximately 8 o'clock that morning, Marise left her family's home and started the familiar 6-block walk to school alone. It was a route she had traveled many times before. In Hazleton, children routinely walked to school without adult supervision. Parents trusted their neighborhoods, Neighbors recognized one another, and nothing about that morning suggested that Marise was facing any danger. But somewhere along those 6 blocks, she disappeared. When she failed to arrive at school, her absence was immediately unusual. Marise was known as a dependable student who rarely missed class without explanation. As the morning continued, concern spread from the school to her family. Her father began searching the streets around St. Joseph's Church and the surrounding neighborhood. Police were notified, and members of the community joined the search. In a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, many believed someone would soon find the missing 9-year-old. Instead, the hours passed without answers. Then, during the afternoon, events took a devastating turn. In the nearby Millsville section of Hazel Township, a man was giving his teenage nephew a driving lesson along quiet roads near abandoned coal mining land. Looking toward one of the old refuse pits, they noticed what first appeared to be a discarded mannequin or doll lying among the debris. As they moved closer, they realized it was the body of a child. The victim was identified as Marise Chiverella. Investigators determined that she had been abducted during her walk to school. She had been assaulted and killed before being left in the abandoned coal refuse pit. The 2 cans of fruit she had intended for her teacher remained beside her, a heartbreaking reminder of the simple act of kindness that had begun her morning. Within hours, a missing child investigation had become one of the most shocking homicide cases in Pennsylvania. For the Chiverella family, life was forever divided into before and after March 18, 1964. A daughter whose dreams had barely begun was suddenly gone. Her brothers and sisters had lost a sibling. Her parents faced a loss no family expects to endure. The tragedy reached far beyond a single household. Across Hazleton, parents who had once watched their children walk to school without worry began seeing those same streets through a different lens. The routines that had defined daily life no longer felt as safe as they had only a day earlier. A community built on familiarity was now united by grief, uncertainty, and one question that no one could answer. Who had taken Marise Chiverella, and how could someone commit such a crime in a town where almost everyone knew each other? For investigators, that question would become the beginning of a search that would outlast generations. The discovery of Marise Chiverella's body marked the end of one search, but it was only the beginning of another. Investigators from the Pennsylvania State Police immediately launched one of the largest homicide investigations the region had ever seen. Officers worked to reconstruct Marise's final movements, identify everyone who might have seen her that morning, and determine where the abduction had taken place. The first days were filled with urgency. Residents were interviewed. Neighbors were questioned. Local businesses, schools, and churches became sources of potential leads. Detectives followed every report that seemed even remotely relevant, hoping that someone had noticed a suspicious vehicle, an unfamiliar face, or an unusual encounter along Marise's route to school. The crime scene itself provided investigators with important physical evidence. Although forensic science in 1964 was limited by today's standards, officers carefully preserved biological material recovered during the investigation. At the time, no one knew whether that evidence would ever be useful. But they chose to preserve it anyway. That decision would eventually become one of the most important made during the entire investigation. Despite the scale of the effort, no clear suspect emerged. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The public attention surrounding the murder slowly faded, but for Marise's family, the passage of time brought no relief. Every unanswered question became part of daily life, while investigators continued searching for a person they could not identify. The case refused to disappear. Over the following decades, new detectives inherited the investigation from retiring investigators. Fresh eyes reviewed witness statements, re-examined evidence, and revisited theories that had once seemed promising. Again and again, they reached the same conclusion. There simply wasn't enough to identify the person responsible. Rather than allowing the case to gather dust, the Pennsylvania State Police kept it active. According to investigators, more than 230 members of the department would work on Marise's case over the years. making it one of the largest and longest-running investigations in the agency's history. Each generation believed it might finally be the one to solve it. Each eventually encountered the same obstacle: no name. As forensic science advanced, investigators returned to the preserved evidence. By 2007, technology had progressed enough to develop a DNA profile from the biological evidence collected decades earlier. For the first time, investigators possessed something previous generations never had: a genetic profile belonging to the person who had attacked Marise. It appeared to be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But it wasn't. The DNA profile was entered into law enforcement databases, and investigators began checking for matches on a regular basis. Month after month, they searched again. Nothing. Year after year, the result remained exactly the same: no match. The person connected to the DNA had never entered the databases in a way that could identify him. The evidence had finally found its voice. There was simply no one to answer it. As the decades passed, another painful reality emerged. Marise's parents, Carmen and Marise Chiverella, never learned who had taken their daughter. They spent the rest of their lives living with unanswered questions, hoping that someday the investigation would provide the truth they had waited for since 1964. That day never came for them. Meanwhile, investigators continued looking in every direction. What made the mystery even more difficult was that nothing suggested the killer had vanished immediately after the crime. Years later, investigators would discover information that made the case even harder to comprehend. The man ultimately connected to Marise's murder had lived in Hazleton at the time of the crime. His home was only 6 or 7 blocks from the Chiverella family residence. For years after the murder, he remained part of the same community. People passed him on sidewalks, shopped in the same stores, visited the same neighborhoods. Yet his name never surfaced during the investigation. The irony became even more striking when records showed that he was later arrested in connection with a violent sexual assault in 1974. He later faced additional criminal charges in 1978 involving reckless endangerment and harassment. Even then, Marise's murder remained unsolved. No evidence connected him to the crime. No witness identified him. No investigative lead pointed in his direction. He remained invisible. By the beginning of the 21st century, the investigation had become a race against time. Witnesses grew older. Memories faded. Some detectives who had devoted years of their careers to the case retired without seeing an answer. Others passed away. With every passing year, it seemed less likely that the truth would ever be known. Yet investigators refused to close the file, because although time had buried the trail, it had never erased the evidence. Somewhere within those preserved pieces of forensic evidence was the identity of Marise Chiverella's killer. The challenge was no longer collecting clues. It was finding a way to finally understand them. By the late 2010s, investigators had reached a familiar conclusion. The evidence still existed. The DNA profile still existed. What was missing was a way to connect that DNA to a name. A new investigative approach offered that possibility. Rather than searching only criminal databases, investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy, a method that compares crime scene DNA with voluntary public genealogy databases to identify distant biological relatives. The process does not immediately identify a suspect. Instead, it provides starting points that must be carefully researched through family history. In 2019, working with Parabon Nanolabs, investigators uploaded the unknown DNA profile to GEDmatch. The result was encouraging, but far from conclusive. The closest match was only a distant relative. Turning that distant connection into the identity of a single individual would require months of painstaking research. In 2020, that challenge was taken on by Eric Schubert, a young genealogist whose experience in family history research had already attracted attention within the forensic genealogy community. Schubert approached the investigation one branch of a family tree at a time. Starting with distant DNA matches, he traced generations of births, marriages, deaths, and family connections. Every new discovery led to more records, more descendants, and more names that had to be verified or eliminated. It was slow, methodical work. There were no dramatic breakthroughs. No single document suddenly solved the mystery. Instead, the investigation advanced through careful elimination until one family line continued to fit the evidence while others did not. Eventually, one individual emerged as the strongest candidate, James Paul Forte. Investigators compared what they now knew about Forte with the historical facts of the case. He had lived in Hazleton at the time of Marise's murder, placing him in the right place during the relevant period. But genealogy alone could never close the case. The DNA evidence had to confirm it. That presented one final obstacle. James Paul Forte had died in 1980 at the age of 38 after suffering a heart attack. He had never married and had left no children whose DNA could be used for comparison. Without a direct biological sample, investigators could not establish scientific certainty. There was only one remaining option. They would need to exhume his remains. After nearly 58 years of unanswered questions, the investigation stood closer to the truth than ever before. But until the DNA spoke, the case was still waiting for its final answer. The exhumation was approved, and forensic specialists recovered biological samples from James Paul Forte's remains. Scientists then compared that DNA with the biological evidence preserved from Marise Chiverella's murder nearly 6 decades earlier. On February 3, 2022, the results came back. The DNA matched. For the first time since March 18, 1964, investigators could identify the person responsible for Marise Chiverella's murder with scientific certainty. 1 week later, on February 10th, the Pennsylvania State Police announced that the state's oldest cold case solved through genetic genealogy had finally reached its conclusion. The answer was both extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The man responsible had been living only 6 or 7 blocks from the Chiverella family when Marise was killed. He had remained part of the same community for years afterward. Yet his name had never surfaced during the original investigation or during the decades that followed. There would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom testimony. James Paul Forte had died more than 40 years before the case was solved. Justice, in the traditional sense, was no longer possible. For Marise's family, however, the announcement brought something they had been denied for almost 58 years: the truth. Her siblings later explained that it was not complete closure, because nothing could restore the life that had been taken. But it was a sense of closure. For decades they had lived with uncertainty, wondering whether the person responsible might still be unknown or might have harmed someone else. Now, at last, they knew. They also reflected on the values their parents had carried throughout their lives. Their hope had never centered on revenge. It had centered on justice. Sadly, Carmen and Mary Chiverella did not live to hear the answer they had waited for. The truth arrived too late for them, but it arrived nonetheless. Marise Chiverella was only 9 years old when her life ended. The years she never lived became part of the story just as much as the investigation itself. Her family was left to imagine the milestones she never reached, while generations of Hazleton residents remembered the day their community lost a sense of security that had once seemed unquestionable. The investigation also left behind an enduring lesson. Evidence preserved with care can outlast the limits of contemporary science. The detectives who collected and protected forensic evidence in 1964 could not have imagined the technology that would eventually identify Marise's killer nearly 6 decades later. Their decision ensured that the truth remained recoverable, even after memories faded and witnesses were gone. Marise's case stands as a reminder that some investigations are measured not in months or years, but in generations. The answer came long after her parents had passed away. Long after the man responsible could face justice in court, yet it came before the truth itself was lost. For one family, one community, and one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases, Time delayed justice. It did not erase it.